Hi everybody, welcome back. In the last lecture, I described the system of criminal liability not as a mechanism for the absolute deterrence of crime, but as a mechanism to distinguish inefficient from efficient crimes, and through the imposition of a criminal liability price to discourage only inefficient crimes and effectively to encourage efficient crimes. This isn't the way most people think about the criminal justice system. Most people are more comfortable with the assumption that the law means what it says when it says you shouldn't commit a crime, and that it therefore tries to deter all crimes absolutely. But my suggestion is that the criminal justice system is in fact in business to do something quite different than that, and that it's not tuned, as it were, to eliminate the greatest amount of crime possible, but to control crime at a level that's analogous to the way in which cost imposition is controlled through the exchange system. How can we see all of this? That is, how do we know that this is what the criminal justice system is trying to do? What is it that the criminal justice system in its operation reveals to us that gives us the confidence to say that we think we know what the criminal justice system is trying to do? There are three things, there are more actually, but I'll point only to three aspects or characteristics of the American system of criminal liability that are consistent with the view of criminal liability that I've just expressed. This doesn't demonstrate that the view of criminal liability I've expressed is correct, but it is consistent with these observations. And so that this consistency can give us more confidence in interpreting the operation of the criminal justice system as a mechanism to distinguish efficient from inefficient crimes, and through the imposition of criminal liability to encourage or tolerate efficient crimes and discourage or deter inefficient crimes. The first of the things that we see in the operation of the criminal justice system is illustrated by the indictment, which is up on the screen. This is a copy of the actual indictment in a criminal case against a member of the New York City Council who was indicted in the year 2010 on grounds having to do with the usual things: bribery, selling of influence of office, and so on. The defendant was a politician named Hiram Monserrat, and he was a city council member from Queens in New York, and he was accused of the federal crime of accepting a bribe in connection with his official business. People were hurt by this. After all, as a result of the bribes, Monserrat would have taken action as a politician or a political figure that he might not have taken absent the payment of the bribe, and presumably somebody was hurt by this. This is why it's illegal to commit a bribe or to accept a bribe in this way. But you'll notice that whoever it was that was directly hurt by the crimes that Mr. Monserrat is alleged to have committed in this indictment, the plaintiff in the criminal case is not any direct victim at all. The plaintiff in the criminal case is, as it says on the indictment, the United States of America, or more precisely, the people of the United States of America. That is to say, the plaintiff in a criminal proceeding is not the direct victim, the person who is the one who suffered the most at the hands of the criminal. As we've said, that victim has recourse in the tort liability system. The plaintiff in a criminal proceeding is the state, and the state represents the indirect victims and not the direct victims. And the indirect victims are, in principle, everyone in the society. In reality, of course, not everybody knows about every crime. And so one of the legal fictions of the system is just the opposite. It's assumed that everybody does know about the existence of every crime, and that every crime creates outrage in the entire citizenry. Some points about this. As we've seen, direct victims retain their right to sue in tort. But the criminal proceeding is not about direct victims. It's not about compensating them. It's not about assuaging their situation. To the extent that direct victims are involved in the criminal proceeding at all, it's as witnesses to help determine the guilt and the degree of guilt of the defendant, rather than themselves to be compensated by anything that happens in the criminal court. Instead, the purpose of the criminal proceeding is to mediate the dispute, in our earlier example, between Mr. Montserrat and the people of the United States of America, not between Mr. Montserrat and the people who might have been the direct victims of his crime. A second point is that since the criminal process is directed not at direct victims, but only at indirect victims, people who suffer moral cost as a result of what the offender has done, it's not necessary that any crime have a direct victim at all. We do, in fact, in the United States at any rate, have many victimless crimes, as they're called. They're not really victimless crimes in this analysis, but they are crimes without direct victims. I've suggested earlier that in the state of Connecticut, it's illegal to use cocaine, not just in our friend Simone's dormitory room, but anywhere in the state of Connecticut. But if I purchase cocaine from somebody in a transaction which is satisfactory to me and the seller of the cocaine, and then I use the cocaine in my own room by myself, there is no direct victim of my crime. Nobody has suffered any economic cost at all as a result of my transaction with the dealer and my subsequent use of the cocaine in the privacy of my own home. But other people in the state may know, in principle, that I've done this and be terribly offended by it. The great American journalist H.L. Mencken once memorably said that a Puritan was somebody who was offended at the thought that somebody else might be having fun. Victimless crimes have this property. People are offended by the knowledge that other people are using cocaine. People are offended by the knowledge that other people are gambling. People are offended by the knowledge that other people employ prostitutes or other consensual sex workers. None of these activities imposes direct cost, economic cost, on anyone. Nobody but the indirect victims participates in any of these transactions involuntarily. Victimless crimes are crimes that create moral cost and thus are treatable through the criminal liability system, but they're crimes that create only moral cost and only in indirect victims and don't have any direct victims at all. And finally, punishments, again, as we'll see in a moment, are exacted so as to compensate indirect victims in kind for the moral costs that they've suffered at the hands of offenders. They've been made to suffer internally and psychically rather than financially or physically, and the compensation that they get from offenders through the criminal justice system is the satisfaction that the offender is now suffering psychically and mentally, but not necessarily physically or economically. A second way that we can see the operation of the criminal justice system as a system of efficient price exaction is suggested by a particular norm of criminal justice, which has characterized most people's attitudes about criminal justice from the beginning. Here's one expression of it by Gilbert and Sullivan in their famous operetta, The Mikado, in a song where the Mikado sings, "My object all sublime I shall achieve in time, to let the punishment fit the crime, the punishment fit the crime." Making the punishment fit the crime was old news in 1885 because you can read the same thought in Exodus, the very first book of the Bible. In Exodus chapter 21, verses 23 through 25, it says, "And if any mischief follow, then thou shalt give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe." That is, Punishments are proportional and not infinite. Punishments are graduated according to the law's ranking of crimes by seriousness, and punishments reflect the law's judgment as to the seriousness of the crime. Shoplifting is a relatively trivial crime, although it is a crime. Murder is the most serious crime, and the penalty for murder is very, very much greater than the penalty for shoplifting. And in between the low-level crime of shoplifting and the very high-level crime of murder, there's a whole range of other crimes: larceny, robbery, armed robbery, fraud, sexual assault, rape, all sorts of things. All sorts of things. And the job of the legislature, in part, is to rank those offenses, first to determine which kinds of activities should be crimes, but once those crimes have been determined, to rank those crimes in terms of their seriousness and to measure that seriousness in terms of the penalties which are associated with that crime. More serious crimes get higher penalties, less serious crimes get lower penalties, so the punishments are graduated proportionally to seriousness. Notice that this is not necessarily the way that criminal punishment has to be imposed. Suppose, for example, that we were interested in the absolute deterrence of crime. Indeed, most people would think that what the criminal law is actually in business to do is to deter as much crime as possible, indeed, to deter crime absolutely in the ideal case. And indeed, it's within the grasp of the criminal liability system to at least approach the absolute deterrence of crime. What would this require? Well, suppose you caught a shoplifter tomorrow morning, a shoplifter who had simply taken a sweater off of a shelf in a store and managed to walk out of the store without paying for the sweater, and then was immediately apprehended by the store detective and charged with the crime of shoplifting. In the real world, shoplifting is typically punished by a very, very short prison term, maybe 6 months in prison at the most. How could we stop shoplifting? Well, suppose we took that one shoplifter that we caught and we drew and quartered him and then chopped off his head. That is, we performed a terribly horrible punishment upon him, all out of proportion to what he had done. He'd be like Admiral Byng. But as a result of that terribly disproportional punishment, we would have shown that we were serious about stopping shoplifting, and no rational shoplifter would ever take the chance of shoplifting again if that shoplifter knew that there was even a possibility that this horrible punishment would be visited upon him. That is, we could approach the absolute deterrence of crime by simply punishing every crime that everybody commits at the maximum level of seriousness. If we did this, then the only crimes that would be committed would be by people who either were irrational and not paying attention to the possibility of punishment at all, or by the vanishingly small number of people for whom a crime like shoplifting would produce more value to them than the price of a horrible death and a horrible punishment to create it. So we don't do that. We don't take the action that would be required to approach absolute deterrence. This is an idea that many people have difficulty wrapping their brains around. How is it that the criminal law could be in business in such a way that it doesn't deter as much crime as possible, and indeed where it seems to be encouraging some kinds of crimes rather than discouraging all crimes? What do we do instead? Well, as we've seen, we try to match the punishment to the costs of the crime. The reason that shoplifting is punished so much less severely than murder is because the moral costs that are imposed by an act of shoplifting are much, much smaller than the moral costs that are imposed by an act of murder. Everybody knows that murder is an outrageously unjust thing to do. When somebody commits a murder, people's reaction is to be horrified and to be furious. When people commit a shoplifting, their reaction is to be angry and to wish that that had not happened and to hope that the perpetrator has something done to him which will teach him a lesson. But not to put him in the electric chair or put him in the gas chamber, but only to punish him in proportion to what it was that he had done. But if we do this, as I've emphasized many times, this will not deter as many crimes as would those very, very high penalties for every crime. And more importantly, matching punishments to the cost of the crime will mean that in principle, only inefficient crimes will be deterred. Only those crimes which produce less value for the perpetrator than they produce cost for the indirect victims will be deterred by the imposition of the criminal liability price. If, on the other hand, the offender believes that the economic and moral value to him of committing the crime is greater than the sum of the moral costs borne by all the people who are outraged by the crime, then the crime is an efficient crime. More value is created with the commission of the crime than if the crime were not committed. And the criminal liability system is there to make sure that once such a crime is committed, the perpetrator shows his bona fides, as it were, by paying the appropriate liability price that in principle compensates the indirect victims for the moral cost of the crime, and that crime will not be deterred by such a system of punishment. The third way that we can see the criminal justice system operating so as to support this view of what it is trying to do has to do with the nature of punishment. Indeed, everybody knows that punishment by imprisonment, which is the way that Americans are primarily punished by the law, is a very, very unhappy situation. Anybody who's ever been in a prison in any capacity, not just as an inmate, but as a visitor or as somebody who is employed to work in the prison, everybody knows that prisons are extraordinarily unpleasant places for people to be. Not only is their liberty deprived while they're in the prison, that is, their physical body is incarcerated and not allowed beyond certain physical spaces, and their motions in the course of a day are highly regulated by the discipline of the prison. Prisons are lonely, prisons are violent, and there are a lot of bad people in prisons. It is not a very, very happy place to be. Moreover, everybody understands what it would be like to lose your liberty, to be in fear of violence all the time, and to be lonely for as long as people who are imprisoned are lonely. I've never been imprisoned, although I have visited a prison and I have worked in a prison. And I can understand and appreciate the kind of suffering that goes on in a prison. I've spoken to prisoners, and indeed I've been able, at least imaginatively, to put myself in their place and to imagine what it would be like to spend a year or a decade or a lifetime in prison, and I can understand why it would be such an unpleasant thing. Okay? So if somebody is punished by imprisonment, and I am in principle aware that he is being punished by imprisonment, then I know what's happening to him, and I can appreciate the kind of cost that he is suffering as a result of his incarceration. It's this quality of incarceration that makes it compensation in kind for the kinds of psychic or moral costs that were imposed by the crime in the first place. One might say, as some economists have proposed, that a better way to punish offenders would be to fine them rather than to expend the money that we have to spend to support an expensive system of incarceration. Prisons are very expensive to operate. They're in business only to produce suffering and misery for their inmates. And so these economists ask, why can't we save all of that money and inflict the same kind of suffering on offenders simply by charging them money, the same way that the tort liability system does? And the answer to that is that different people experience different costs from the deprivation of a given sum of money. If I'm very wealthy and I'm fined $10,000, it won't hurt me as much as if I'm poor and am fined $10,000. And so fines cannot exact the same degree of suffering in different people, because different people have different attitudes about money, different people have different amounts of money, and therefore the same fine will inflict different levels of disutility or suffering on different individuals. Loss of liberty and living in loneliness and fear, as one must in a prison, doesn't have this variability across individuals. Most people believe that almost everybody suffers in the same way and largely to the same degree by the fact of imprisonment. As a result, a 5-year sentence can be expected to impose more or less the same quantity of unpleasant disutility on person A as it does on person B, and that makes imprisonment, or the length of a sentence, a useful currency to measure the seriousness of a crime and to use to compensate the bearers of moral cost, who observe offenders suffering in compensation for the costs that those indirect victims themselves have suffered as a result of the offender's act. So to summarize, criminal liability is incurred not to direct victims who are cared for by the tort system, but by indirect victims who are given by the law an entitlement to be free of the moral costs that are imposed by the criminal acts of other people. The rule of proportionality, which governs the American system of criminal liability, and indeed excuse me, most of the systems of criminal liability across the world, is not a system for absolute deterrence, but a system of vengeance organized to distinguish efficient from inefficient cost imposition and to discourage only inefficient cost imposition. Again, this will not achieve the absolute deterrence of cost imposition or the absolute deterrence of crime, but only, ideally, the deterrence of inefficient crimes through marginal cost pricing, the attempt to equate the criminal liability price in terms of a prison sentence with the degree of moral cost suffered by the society at large at the hands of the offender.